So again, I want to thank you all for joining us today. I want to thank you for coming into sort of an organic opening where we had a major event closing in this room. People needed to take a break, and us sort of trying to seamlessly bring people into the work and immediately pushing you into discourse with each other. And the reason that we actually chose to do this activity before we even introduce ourselves or the work for this session is frequently we need ways of entering into the work that's a scaffold. And so this was an adapted block party, and a block party frequently can be used as a pre-reading strategy to get into a more complex text. So this all comes from one text, which we will be introducing some of the work of later on. You're here to talk about microaggressions and implicit bias, but what this is not, let me say what this workshop is not. It's not a shortcut so you don't have to read the articles on microaggressions, or you don't have to do your own reflection on implicit bias. In fact, we're going to anchor some definitions in language, but the focus of our work is really to take us to a place of saying, when we are in a situation where we are facing the ramifications of implicit bias, when we're facing microaggressions, what are some things we could do? How do we create conditions so we can take those on and create a community where that's not happening? And how might we, or what tools might help us to address them when they happen in front of us? And so that's what we're hoping to do today. My name is Greg Peters. I'm the Executive Director of the San Francisco Coalition of Essential Small Schools. Happy to be here in your presence today. And right now, I'd like to pass the agenda on to my colleague, Leora, who will introduce herself.
I will. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Leora. It's really good to see so many familiar faces and colleagues in this work. So as Greg rooted us in, we are here in this session to kind of integrate all of the learning pieces that we've been hearing the last day and a half into what this could actually look like in our practice, both for ourselves, but also for our colleagues in the organizations in which we work. So can I just get a raise of hands? How many of us work in schools? Great. How many of us work in community-based organizations? Okay. And then potentially state agencies, departments of education, government folks? Okay. And then any social work, mental health professionals? Okay. Great, and I'm sure that there are so many other hats that we all live in. We will be talking about schools today as kind of the unit of the window of conversation, and we invite you to transfer, if you don't work in a school, to transfer that conversation to whatever organization in which you work. Check? Check. That was weak sauce. Check? Check. All right, we're gonna work on it. So our essential question that is guiding our learning this afternoon, is that really loud? I get really loud. Okay, you just let me know. Our essential question of what is guiding our learning this afternoon is, what do we need to know about our systemic dominant culture and those it best and least serves in order to build positive school-centered cultures for all? Okay, so we're going to play with the best serves and least serves for the next couple of minutes or so. So we did that. How did everyone feel about the block party? You didn't even know you were in a party. You didn't even know it was called a block party. See? Pedagogical practice already in your toolkit. Okay, so we discussed quotes, as Greg mentioned. And I'm actually not going to spend a lot of time in the what we want to do, because I want to get into the doing. But as we, oh, they spin. That's so fancy, PowerPoint. So what we're hoping to do, what we're hoping to do in the next 90 minutes or so, is to really engage not only in rooting social and historical trauma and how that surfaces and manifests in our school structures and systems and practices, but also engage in some pretty tricky, goopy, and necessarily sticky inquiry, because we are the system. So we're going to do some of that work and what that looks like. Okay. So we're going to open, we're going to focus, we're going to collaborate, and then we're going to close. That's what's going to happen. Questions, comments, concerns? Great. Let's move. I'm going to hand it to Greg. I want to say before, just for our norms, that we will offer all visuals to you. So any of you who have tiny fear font, your fears will be assuaged. So they'll be posting the PowerPoint at the end. We also have a full slide of academic references and also practitioner resources at the end. And you'll get both my email and Greg's email, and we will be at your service for conversation thereafter. We also want to hold space that you will leave this conversation with your needs probably unmet, just to expect and accept a lack of closure from this conversation. We're going to feel that too. There's going to be a lot that we're going to want to offer that we won't get to tie, and that's what we're going to hold on to. Cool?
Based on the looks I just saw on some people's faces, we may have to define at your service.
Oh yeah, that's true. That's true. That's true.
I saw some looks I was like, I don't know if I can live up to that look. So the first slide that we're going to present to you that you cannot read from where you're sitting is a visual that will be handed out to you. And this is SFSS's, that's the acronym for the organization I work at. This is SFSS's framework for transformation. And so what we have learned is that we know that the current context, the current conditions in school, the current results, they require us to interrupt the inequities that are happening for students and their families. And frequently, our system has been built on tons of interruptions, lots of rhetoric of what we need to do, the fact that we need to transform or improve them, but not a lot of work around how does transformation actually take place. And so I'm going to just quickly, very quickly, and one of the resources you'll have is an article that goes more in detail about this, but I'm going to quickly walk through when we talk about the conditions needed for us to create transformative healing spaces for our communities. This framework is a very quick guide to it. So even though this is meant to be, this is cyclical, and the work here is constant and continuous. So just in case anybody, I guess I should give you a chance, if you thought as a result of these 90 minutes that you would be officially dubbed an anti-racist, socially just, and get a badge or an award to hang on your wall, this is the wrong place. That's not where this is not going to happen here. But rather, we hope to plant some seeds to recognize the work that needs to happen is constant and continuous and challenging. And our schools are actually not set up for the conditions needed to do this work. And so we're working with our partners to try and figure out and support them in setting up those conditions. So in this cycle, we always start at the bottom here in this framework, because even though we are in all of these stages continuously, we think it's really important to focus and say, we need to self-assess and identify our current stance and schema. How is it that we make sense of the world? How is it that we express how we make sense of the world? What are our beliefs going into the work that we are doing? What are our conscious beliefs? What are our unconscious beliefs? What is the belief system of our school system, of our society? I really appreciated our keynote this morning, who so incredibly, powerfully, emotionally made clear how history has impacted today by just focusing on one strand of history. It's a complex strand, it's a painful strand, but basically what I left there being very clear about is that our history follows us. Our history has impacted who we are today. So we need to create conditions where we as individuals and where our communities as a whole are taking time to look in the mirror for ourselves and say, what is my stance in the skin I'm in? As a white man doing work that's attached to social justice, what does that mean? How was I brought up? What are my beliefs? Why am I doing this work, and what do I bring to it? But we also want to do the same for our schools. If we don't know the history of public education, we should take time in our communities to learn the history of public education. You just did this block party, or this amended block party around the text, changing the discourse. We actually thought about possibly doing the block party just with points regarding the history of public education, and how when we look at the laws here in California, around the nation, when we look at the design of public education, we keep saying something's wrong and we need to fix it, and yet the results we're getting are the results our school system was designed to get. So we keep acting like we're trying to fix something that is actually not only fixed, but it is working incredibly well. It's one of the most efficient, effective, self-preserving systems in our society. And unless we know that, we can easily become cogs in that machine thinking we're fighting against it and we're really working for it. So we need to take time in our communities for that type of reflection and learning. The second stage is about creating conditions for interruption or catalytic experiences. Now the good news is evolution happens. Research didn't have to prove that. Evolution happens. The bad news is it's not happening nearly fast enough for the kids who are coming into classrooms today. And so we need to jumpstart transformation. And while we know we need to interrupt inequities, socially, interruption is not naturally accepted. In our school systems, which have been seen as sort of the dumping ground of blame for what the ills of society, there's not a lot of trust for people to interrupt our practice when inequity results. And so there's not a receptacle saying, yes, if you see an inequity, interrupt me. Unless we build the conditions and the support for that to happen. That's going to be the focus of some of the work that we do today. But when we talk about creating those interruptive and catalytic experiences and the conditions for that, that's a lot of scaffolding. It's practice with sentence stems. It's understanding, are we here for the same purpose? I go to so many schools that have 12 different efforts going to address their inequities, and yet the leadership, because they want to meet the adults where they're at, saying as long as they subscribe to 4 of them. Well, unless you have any one thing that everyone must subscribe to, you're potentially doing a lot of nothing. And so we need to be able to create conditions, and there needs to be strong leadership to do that work. Once we create conditions where when inequities occur in the moment, we have tools, language, agreements to interrupt them, we need not to jump right into action mode, because if we do, there's a possibility we're just going to repeat the same patterns that we just interrupted. Most of the educators I know got into the profession in order to help make a difference. They didn't go into the profession to harm people, to harm students. So chances are, when I'm perpetuating an inequity and somebody points that out, I was probably doing what I thought was my best. And so I'm going to say, thank you for interrupting that. Let me go do my best again. Well, my best again was the same thing that got me here. And so how do we get our schools and their communities to slow down and to create opportunities to make new meaning of our inequities? And we believe this happens in 3 places. And the first place is it has to happen on our own. If I'm all down with equity as long as I'm getting paid, as long as it's within my contractual hours, I am not down with equity. Because if we are not committing to transforming our very belief systems, even when we are outside of our schools, that's where our implicit bias comes in with us, whether we want it or we don't want it. We also need to create spaces where we're working in affinity. Now, when we talk about affinity, when we talk about demographics, or we talk about the skin we're in, we want to answer that in a complex way. Intersectionality matters. And we want to ask ourselves, who are the students in our school that are being least reached? Because that's a demographic that matters. But as an example, for our examples, we always start with race, because race always matters. And so when we talk about being in affinity with that example, we talk about we need spaces where white people are sitting with white people doing the work white people need to do. And we need spaces where people of color are sitting with people of color doing the work people of color need to do. And sometimes that work towards the same outcome might look a little different. But here's what we know is common in those spaces. 1, we need to be in spaces where some healing can take place. And sometimes we're not going to be able to do as much healing when we're in the room with the people either that we are microaggressing or we're being microaggressed by. 2, we need to be in that room to have the conversation that needs to happen but doesn't happen because the other shouldn't hear it. Because we know this, I'll speak for myself as a white man, there are conversations I need to have with white people, and sometimes white people need to have with me, that my colleagues across racial difference do not need to bear witness for again, and again, and again. And similarly, my colleagues of color said they need their spaces not just for that healing, because they need to have conversations and not put each other out there in a vulnerable place to be pushed under the bus by white people who might be looking for the one example to say, well, I know a person who said. So we need those spaces, and we frequently think those spaces don't belong in schools. They do. that has to be part of our work. Not just with each other, even with our students, even with our families. And ultimately, that work alone that I have to do, that work in affinity I have to do, is also that I can be better at being an ally across difference. And that's for every one of us. And so the third space is very specific, intentional spaces to bring people together across difference to do work about difference and about commonalities across difference. So how many of our schools have that situated as part of their professional development plan, as part of their learning spaces, as part of their curriculum with their students, and as part of the way they bring families together? And only then, when we make new meaning, are we actually ready to go into the bold or changed or radical new action in stage 4. Because this is where we have to really be thinking about what are we deconstructing so we can completely reconstruct. We're not trying to tweak here. And when we talk about reconstructing, you know, based on what you've already heard at this conference, there's going to be social pushback. And so when we get into that space and the conditions needed for that bold new action, that's really complex. And so if you want your actions to be limited to that which is in your control, your classroom or your school or whatnot, there's perhaps less conditions that you need to create. But as soon as you start making a difference that's seen outside your community, you also have to invest in the relationships with politicians, with privileged communities, with universities, and other external partners. That we have to now be negotiating and nurturing relationships to allow for that radical change to happen. Because once we say, oh look, it can be different, all the people who have been fighting for it not to be different, their egos become involved consciously or unconsciously, and they need that different success to fail. And that will play out. And so we need to create conditions where bold, radical new action can take place, and we can actually have and celebrate risk-taking. We can have and celebrate informed, key word here, informed failure. And the reason I talk about informed failure is if we know I keep doing everything I've been doing forever, I'm going to keep failing the way that I've been failing forever. We sometimes say you won't be punished if you keep failing the same way. But if you try something different and you fail, there's going to be a spotlight on your failure. We have to shift that paradigm. We have to flip the script on that narrative. So underneath the work that we do is this framework. And when we work in partnership with folks, we're asking people to self-assess. And we have strategies, etc. But where are we at? Where do we need to put some emphasis? And this is the work we need to do as individuals. We heard this morning that if the services aren't the first step is the work we do with ourselves. We can't help create transformative spaces if we're not engaged in a constant, continuous cycle of transformation for ourselves. And so hopefully for the rest of this workshop, you will constantly remind yourself to be looking in the mirror and asking yourself, how do I play into this? All right? So I'm going to push us into another piece of work. And this is just an example of how we frequently hear people say, this is so complex, we could never do it. And we say, one step at a time. If you think we'll be done in a 2-hour session, then you're not committed to this work, is the narrative we bring to our partner schools and districts. It's one step at a time, and then when people engage, they're like, oh, that's what that looks like. So we're going to try something. That first stage was about stance and schema awareness. We're going to do a little piece of work together to just explore stance and schema awareness. So I'm going to ask everybody to either stand up, or if you're in a place where you're like, or you don't want to move around, turn to someone next to you. Find somebody that you're going to talk to. That's all. But you have to be in a pair. If there's an odd person out, Leora will participate. So you can't be in trios. Just find anybody you want to talk to. Okay? You can do that in 30 seconds. I am confident. If you do not have a partner, raise your hand. If you do not have a partner, raise your hand. We have one person. Great. Leora? Wonderful. All right, now I'm going to give the instructions. And yes, that was on purpose. So we're going to do a piece of work. It's called Who Am I? Each of you will get the same amount of time. And just because I know we got started later and I know someone's going to open that door and say, you got to hurry up, I'm going to adjust the times a little bit than what's set up here perhaps. And what you're going to do is right now you're going to identify who's going to go first. So just quietly, silently, volunteer, point, strong arm. Who's going to go first? Okay. If you are caught in Rochambeau right now, so now that you know who's going to go first, the next set of instructions. The first person is going to have just under a minute to respond to the question, who am I? That's all you're going to do. You're just going to respond to that question. The second person, you are just listening. You actually cannot say anything. You are being a full-on listener. Well, we haven't started yet, so it was all practice. It was all practice. And the second person, you're not going to say a word. You're just going to be an active listener, with one exception. You have permission to speak under one condition. If before you hear me say time is up, the person says, I'm done, you have permission to just gently and kindly say, but who are you? When that minute, or just under a minute, is finished, the second person will become the speaker, the first person will become the listener, we'll do a mini debrief, and then we're going to continue the work in a different way, just to give you a little bit of a map. All right? Okay, so we have just under a minute. First person, who are you? Okay. Thank you, person one. And no, that was quick. Thank you, person one. And forgive me, but I am going to push us into keeping that time, and we'll talk about it in the debrief. Person two, you have just under a minute. Who are you?
My name is Karen. I'm not married. I have 2 children. I was in Los Angeles for most of the last 23 years now. I went back east briefly. I grew up in Kansas, and then moved to Maryland, and then I moved to Los Angeles after college. I'm a teacher and playwright. I have a small children's theater company that I've had for about 20 years, actually 1997 when we started, so called Creative Playground, and then I work at a small progressive school called West End.
Thank you, person two. Thank you, person two. All right, give a high five. Say thank you to your partner. As I said, we're going to do a very quick debrief. I know, just so you know, we could actually do this for an hour and really go deep into it. So just know that there's more to really reflect on and unpack with this. But just can I hear from 1 or 2 people just to say, how was that for you? What came up for you in just doing that first piece? Please, back here, loud.
It was great because we both talked about our name and the history of our name.
Nice.
And what we call ourselves, and that in a short period of time told us a lot about each other, and it was great.
Beautiful, thank you so much. And we're going to have one more person here, and I promise I'll get people the next round too.
So I had wonderful Yolanda here, and I thought it was great because I got to find out the person next to me who's a really strong person who's been through some really difficult things, and she overcame them. And I'm just really happy to be able to.
That's beautiful. Thank you, thank you. So here's one observation I just want to put out there. I'm hearing people making these connections, and again, but we don't have time to do this work. How much time did that take? Less than 2 minutes. Can anybody think back to this last week and think, is there 2 minutes you would have rather been doing something like this than what you were doing? And you don't need someone to give you instructions to be making those personal connections, but also to put that mirror up for you, because you're not actually just talking about the other person. Who are you talking about? Yeah, exactly. All right, so next set of instructions. Find a different person to talk to, but this time I'm just going to ask that you try to find somebody you don't work with and don't normally talk to. All right? You can do that in 30 seconds. You're going to get about a minute. It's going to get a little bit more longer, a little bit more time. You're going to get uninterrupted time unless you say you're done, and then that person can ask, oh really, who are you? And you're just going to answer the same prompt, who are you? Second person, you're going to get just about a minute to answer that same prompt on the second round. Oh, except for this. You can't say anything you said in the first round. Okay. We're going to go with the honor system. We're going to trust that you're going to honor the system because then you'll get the full experience. All right? Person one, who are you? Person one.
I know, I was just...
All right. How many people feel, ooh, but there was so much more? Wonderful. When this is not facilitated, find each other. Keep talking. Person two, you have just about a minute. Who are you?
So I'm also Jewish. So where I live, there's a lot of Jewish people. Artist. Love it that you brought that up because I probably wouldn't do shows. So I share that with you. Let's see. I am a wife and friend and supporting a friend who's going through some challenging stuff. So I'm someone who right now feels that stress and responsibility. And I want to show up in a way that's helpful and not overpowering and present, and I guess I wish I could fix and I can't fix, and so
Thank you,
present
person
that.
two. Thank you, person two.
Seattle.
So
I know,
one
Seattle.
of the
Pretty good.
observations
I live in
I'm already
Portland.
hearing is
Okay.
a minute feels different based on if you're talking or listening. All right. So let's also again give a high five to your partner, please. Thank you. So again, just want to hear from a couple of people. What felt different this time? What was different this time? Doing it a second time, a little bit longer time.
Well, you know, I'm so busy being in all different capacities, but labeling it, giving it that sort of adjective label was somewhat challenging, especially the second time around, because I had kind of created a nice list the first time around.
You're like, I prepared for the first one. That's great, thank you. What's that? Do you want to repeat a little louder?
Oh, okay. So I said that the first time around I had given a nice little list, and so the second time made it a bit more challenging to think of some more adjectives because I'm really busy being many things, but to actually reflect on myself and give it a label was a bit challenging, more so the second time around.
Nice. I'm seeing some agreement with that. Nice. How about right over here?
Mine was the opposite. The first time I listed all the stuff, right? I'm a this, I listed, but the second time I was more about a story about myself.
Nice.
It was way more personal,
Nice.
about the core.
Nice. Nice. Love that. Okay, we're going to just do one more, and then we're going to move on and continue this piece, this round.
Yeah, the second one I felt more like tender, you know, and I wasn't sure,
Yeah.
because I don't know this woman yet.
Yeah, yeah.
More vulnerable to me.
So the folks who felt like they were taking more risk the first time, I just want you to have some metacognition. What if you were required to tell what you said the first time? I mean the second time. Like whatever you shared in that second round, what if that's what you had to start by sharing? So even having some idea of how we scaffold into these identity conversations and reflections makes a difference in 4 minutes. Okay? So I'm going to push us to one more partnering, This time I'm going to push you to find somebody that you don't normally talk to or work with, and as much across difference as possible. And what do I mean by across difference? Obviously, that means a lot, right? It means a lot, because if we could sit and tell each other's story, we'll find out we're all across difference. But we know that the world works on assumptions based on who we see, what we see, so it could be race, gender, age, etc. But try to push as much across difference as possible. Now, because of how math works, I just want to say, if you're the last two people partnering, you may not have as much choice. All right? So go ahead and...
I have a request for someone who is happy to discuss in Spanish. If you can come to me. Spanish-speaking discourse, please come to me.
We both have short hair, though. Okay, so should we keep going? Okay. Hi.
Were you going to keep going?
No, I wanted to.
All right, if you don't have a partner, raise your hand. If you don't have a partner, raise your hand. Here we go, we found each other.
Dr. Henry?
Fabulous. Great, excellent. Okay, so shall I give I'd like to give the instructions now. I'm not going to ask you to identify who's going first. If you went first, both rounds, raise your hand, please. You're going second. If you went second, both rounds, raise your hand, please. You're going first. If there's a tie, if neither of you raised your hand or both of you raised your hand, anything but Rochambeau, identify who's going first. All right, now that we know that, and you can think about why I did that later, that was intentional, it wasn't just for fun. You're going to get a little bit over a minute. Again, just a little bit. Yeah, I know, right? She's like, except when I talk, then it's going to be less. And the person who goes first, you're going to answer the question, who are you? Same rules. You're not going to be interrupted unless you say you're done, and then that person's just going to ask, no, really, who are you? And the only difference is you can't say anything that you said in the first two rounds. Both rounds. Okay? I'm not going to give you time to come up with a script. So, person one, go ahead and begin. All right, thank you, person one. Thank you, person one. Person two, you have a little bit over a minute. Who are you? Thank you, person 2. Thank you, everyone. Please give your partner a high five and some beautiful hugs, a fist bump. Let's come back to debrief this final round. Come on. Yeah. Let's debrief this final round. So for this final round, this is beautiful noise. For this final round, and again, those debrief questions we've been using, there's lots to be learned. I've done this activity no short of many dozens of times, and I'm always thinking something different. I'm always learning something different. And so, knowing that we're pushing through with these different questions, I just want to plant these seeds for your reflection beyond even these minutes that we're spending together. So I want to bring a little bit of a meta lens to this. Why did we choose to do this piece of work with you all in this workshop today the way that we did? Why did we do this in the way that it unfolded? Try to hear from a few people. Please.
Well, I think that it helps to bring down assumptions and barriers and the energy that comes with being different as we move into a very sensitive topic.
I think we learn about ourselves as we listen, and also about ourselves as we communicate, and the dynamic.
Can you say that a little louder, please?
So we learn about ourselves because we're communicating our own experiences or whatever, but then also because in our listening, we're relating what they're saying, we're trying to integrate it, and I think that's an active process, and this activity really helps with that.
Thank you. 1, 2. Go ahead.
Create connection.
Yeah.
Connection.
Connection. Beautiful. Thank you.
And I think the work that we're doing, because we're talking about issues like this, that we need to be self-aware, and so it helps promote that sense of self-awareness, number one, and that sense of connection, but also the connection that we all have similar experiences, even though they might be a little different.
That's right.
We have similar experiences too, and we need to connect on that and help us move forward in terms of common goals.
Right. So in and of itself, we're actually modeling the interruption of our own biases that we think is going to be so much hard work. We're actually modeling it in these moments and saying, oh, this is what it looks like, and this is what it feels like for me to check a bias I might have had of somebody. You know, and it will get more difficult. If all we needed to do to end racism was to have these 3 rounds, you know, I mean, it will get more difficult. But we frequently don't do what's so difficult because we're afraid that it's worse than it really is. And if we scaffold into it and have these positive experiences, we're willing to take that next step and that next step. And then the next thing you know, you're out on the skinny branch and you didn't even realize it. And one more person, please. You had your hand up?
It also makes you pull back the layers of who you are, and makes you go deeper and deeper in examining things, so that you're listening off not only at your own layers, but understanding that the individual is also building that.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you so much. So thank you all. This is an example of what it might look like, because when people hear that, oh, we need to do identity work, they're thinking, oh, we got to sign up for Ancestry.com. Well, maybe you might want to do that. That might be part of your work. But you all are doing identity work right now. So that's an example of what it feels like. Thank you for engaging in that so authentically and beautifully. And what we know is, regardless of which of the 4 stages we're creating conditions for, discourse is essential. 1, we can't do this work alone, and 2, we can't do this work with other people and assume we're always on the same page without having constant, iterative, meaning-making discourse. So much of our discourse is based on, currently, in the current system, so much of our discourse is based on the assumption we have the same beliefs. The assumption we have the same definitions. The assumption we have the same goals. And so we have to create spaces where, even though we're so busy, discourse is valued enough that we are creating time and space for that meaningful discourse to happen, and that requires strong leadership. It requires leadership that understands we need to take time and calibrate our language, and it's not as simple as just saying something at a staff meeting. We need to take time to develop practicing and using shared norms of the desired behaviors we want. I'm not talking about the norm, be on time. That is not a norm. That is a job expectation. In other jobs, you're fired if you're not on time. Why are we getting into places that serve our young people and say, we're going to really aspire to be on time? Nope. Not when you're pushing kids out of your class because they're not on time. So we need to have strong leadership to talk about what does it mean to calibrate to the uncomfortable behaviors we need for real change to happen. And ultimately, we need leaders who are going to model and create spaces to model and scaffold the discourse, the protocols, the processes that we can have collaboration that is focused on equity and not just the next task to do. So discourse can no longer be underrated. It needs to be meaningful and it needs to be leveraged. So, we're going to skip a couple slides here. And I'm going to pass it back on to Leora.
Thanks, GP. Ready? Thanks, GP. Okay, so I get to work and I get to hold a title called School Climate Specialist. And I don't know what that actually means, but I do know that it can provide me the opportunity to hold space for easy conversations or difficult conversations, depending on what I feel ready for and invested in. And part of that school climate world is that we use this graphic of the iceberg often. How many of us have used this in a presentation? Great, so you know which photo stock I've chosen this from. So we're going to keep the analogy of the iceberg for the next couple conversation points. So I'm going to invite us, as we move through the conversation about connecting school climate and mental health and wellness into the arc of this conversation, where you personally, in your own inquiry, what conversations are you ready to dive into, and which conversations are you quick to look away or down when someone brings up in your workspace, as it relates to you as a leader? Okay, so we're bringing the conversation about mental health and wellness because under the arc of social and historical trauma is social and historical resilience. And under that arc is also the conversation, or what have been the narratives around our mental and emotional health and wellness in terms of, for us in the work in schools, how we navigate our pathways to healing. This is the services, right? This is how we think about what services are available to our young people and ourselves, with the assumption that they're meeting the end goal of healing. But that's an assumption that's a whole other workshop. So what I wanted to bring is this conversation that oftentimes when I'm hearing or holding space for an educator to talk about our young people and their mental health and wellness, what is usually the first conversation that comes up? What do you hear them say? Misbehavior, give me other tag words. Disrespectful. Defiant, out of control, lazy. Okay, wow, y'all are quick with negative behavior. I mean, there's gotta be, okay, that's what they said, that's true. Those are all the surface behaviors, right? So for us to hold space for this conversation about discourse being a tool of interruption, we then get to weave in an invitation to bring in a nonviolent communication framework and say, all right, I'm hearing some behaviors named. I'm curious about what the feelings are under those behaviors, and I'm most curious about what needs that young person is holding on to that are unmet, that are then giving life to those feelings and giving life to those actions that you're diagnosing as behaviors. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say it like that, so we can also have another conversation about how that would go down. But this is the parallel of when we connect the conversation around microaggressions and implicit bias. I also want to tag in that often when we think about mental health and wellness, we don't necessarily include the experience of microaggressions or implicit bias, both as the perpetrator and the receiver in this conversation. And it's because and we're going to get to later around how microaggressions can show up, but I want to hold that there is now beautiful social science that links our experience of isms with our mental health and wellness. So in the same way, when we walk into any organization or school, if I walked into any one of your school buildings or your organizations, there's a lot of data that I might pick up that might tell me information about that school's climate. And so we define school climate in the way that what I see on the surface are the programs and services and curricula, and that's great, and that's what usually is reported out. We're doing X, Y, do. Cool. Then the deeper conversation, which requires the culture that Greg is inviting us to get very skilled in holding space in, is having the under the surface conversations around what are the beliefs and norms that are making the decisions that turn into the services and curriculum. So if we put it all together, all of these pieces intersect. If my bias goes uninterrupted, if my bias goes, uninterrupted, I said that right?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. If my bias goes uninterrupted, then I might be deciding what services and curricula need to happen for young people, and there might be deep decisions that are impacting those young people's lives on the daily. And that's a rich conversation and a dynamic conversation that is impacting them and myself as the decision maker for years, that then perpetuates the goals and the outcomes of the system. Right? And so part of what this conference has been asking us to do is to dig into those thoughts and feelings in the past history. And what we're inviting us to think even more deeply about is how can we potentially name what's on top of the surface, and then take a moment of pause and say, okay, so what are the needs that are being met by what's going on the top of the surface? Who's informing those decisions? And how might we actually be able, if some of those services and the top of the surface data are harmful, how might we actually get to unpack them, disrupt them, so we can hold space for what's going on under the surface? Those might be long-term conversations, and they might be very short-term conversations. And that's up for us to chat about. So I'm curious if we can maybe get one or two share-outs about how does this visual land in your work? Where are you seeing this visual land in your work right now? Or this conversation? Yeah, go ahead.
I think if you've done it for a long time, there's that compassion
Louder.
fatigue.
I'm gonna.
And so you can over time distance people from you, make them bad or make them wrong to protect yourself.
Okay, great. So what was your name?
Deborah.
Deborah. So Deborah's introducing the concept of compassion fatigue, which I'm seeing head nods of resonance. That compassion fatigue can play in here as someone, as those of us who are involved in organizational leadership, our compassion fatigue can play a role in potentially pushing us away from feeling the energy or the investment or the willingness to be in that interruptive conversation. Am I capturing that right, Deborah? Okay, you sure?
They say it's really easy to make a diagnosis when you first meet a person. Then if you get to know them more and you understand much more of the depth.
Okay, that was a much bigger golden nugget. Can you say that out loud, much louder for everyone to hear?
It's not my thought, it's Yalom's thought. It's much easier to diagnose a person when you first meet them, give them a psychiatric diagnosis, than if you get to know them, which then would take in all those historical concepts.
It's much easier to diagnose someone on the quick than it is after you get to know them and humanize them. Yes, go ahead.
So in my work, I'm a professional nanny, and one of the things I found in working with families is that with a lot of parents, they like to label the behavior instead of always finding out what the need is. So on the surface, it says, oh, my child just throws tantrums. instead of realizing, okay, well, what are the needs? Okay, is your child hungry? Did they go out and play today? You know, and sometimes you have those conversations and it's a little bit difficult because they're you know, sometimes the parents themselves are tired or whatever the situation is. And even when I worked in schools, the same thing. Label the behavior on the surface. This child is lazy, this child is oppositional, this child is defiant. And then when it comes to trying to figure out what the need is, that conversation doesn't always happen. So they're trying to find solutions to a problem when they don't even really understand what the need is the child is trying to express.
Sure. So even in that experience, which we have compassion for, because also all of us know what the work is like in schools and in the work. There's a luxury in humanizing the other, but that luxury is necessary. And even in that work is when our implicit bias shows up, right? Because our implicit bias potentially has a charged experience with how we understand behavior, even in itself, as we've been talking about the last day and a half. So I'm going to not move it to Greg, because I'm still here. Hey! So we wanted to offer a couple explicit and tangible entry points to how implicit bias shows up in our perceptions, actions, and decision making, which decision making in itself could be an entire conference in terms of how we make decisions and how our decision making are the surfacing of the roots of historical and social trauma and resilience. And so some of the ways in which implicit bias shows up is disproportionality in discipline, although we could push that word to be deeper per our morning conversation. We can look at special education, we can look at educator mindsets and beliefs, and we can look at tracking. But what brings us to the conversation today is we can also look at the dominant discourse. So one of the biggest pieces of dominant discourse in our schools and in our organizations is the curriculum and instruction. Right? That's a huge wave of discourse that is both sometimes in our locus of control, sometimes not in our locus of control. What are other ways that discourse shows up in our organizations? Dominant discourse. So the way in which a dominant discourse would be the way in which our assumptions live presently in our decision making but aren't named explicitly. Yeah, go for it.
One thing, just looking at those bullets, the disproportionality of students in extracurricular activities. That there's a definite, we're from Iowa.
Yes, you are.
And we have a definite disproportionality of students who are in athletics and drama and debate, and then that is a big difference.
Great, thank you. Any other? Yeah, go for it. Deneen.
I think routines and schedules, how we set up the day, it actually defines how we can and cannot connect, and it actually is in support of the curriculum and not the people. So, but it's never a question of the schedule. Do you know?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So schedules are a huge piece of data, and a huge piece of even a master schedule itself can be a form of a dominant discourse. Okay, great. Yeah, Andy, right?
I think that this implicit bias plays out when in our professional roles. So whether that be as an educator, as an administrator, like even people who are in the policy realm or mental health realm, because it's all kind of like that middle piece. The idea that like we only have so much control, we can only do so much. So that bias about our own capacity. I could never serve on a board because blah blah blah. I could never go talk to the principal because blah blah blah. Those things that hold us back as professionals to fight through that dominant discourse, and contributing to compassion fatigue, of course, as well.
Mm-hmm. So how we understand our own positionalities and how power manifests both in our positions, our bodies, and our narratives. Yeah, Laura.
The way we talk about schools in underserved communities and how whether they're failing or succeeding, and what the chaos that might exist, and how we talk about families in those schools together.
Did everyone hear Laura? Yeah, can you do a stand up one
The
louder
teacher
crowd?
voice?
Sorry.
So the way that we talk about, even with well-intentioned, about schools and underserved communities, especially high schools, and the chaos that reigns inside them, and the families that contribute to that, and the kids that are there, and the picture we create about what those schools look like. And often when you go to those schools, it's very different. And until you spend time there and humanize that, we paint a very different picture with our language and with our media and with the way we talk about it.
Thank you. Okay, one more, and then we're going to move forward so we can actually start to get into discourse.
I just wanted to piggyback on that because it's also our belief about what we believe is available as resources for those communities in comparison even to other districts within our larger district.
So even terms like under-resourced have
not
huge...
necessarily what we believe the resources are for those communities. If they're available to other kids in other parts of the district, they should be available for our kids.
That's right. So what I was offering is terms that what we see as under-resourced or underprivileged communities, even in themselves, have huge amounts of communication in that term that can unpack bias that exists in dominant discourse. Okay, thank you. So we're going to move because...
Actually, I'm going to negotiate that in a moment with you. One of the things with the just for time purposes.
Yes, please.
So, but one thing I'm not hearing in your question about dominant discourse that I want to surface and maybe step on a skinny bridge myself right now, I really agree that dominant discourse is very much about talking about systems and talking about students in a way that, again, sort of reinforce the marginalization of some communities over others. And even that language, dominant discourse, and needing to unpack that to an extent, might be used as dominant discourse. And what I didn't hear that I want to just name is dominant discourse is everything I heard, and also it's white talk. And I think we need to name that. That it is the coded language, it is the language of dominant culture that reinforces whiteness as the norm and as the goal. And it's really important, and again, the reason I'm saying I might be stepping on a skinny branch is we don't want to talk about race because we're afraid that the word race means you're calling me a racist, right? But I'm also not going to promise you that it doesn't mean that. But it doesn't automatically mean that. And we don't want to talk about whiteness because then it means that we're talking about every single white person and putting this sort of image on every single white person on an individual level. And until we do our identity work so that we can have the nuanced conversation of the difference of whiteness and white people, and quite frankly, me as a white person, how I might not represent whiteness in its fullest, I can't escape the fact that I benefit from it. And so unless we're going to have those conversations, we're not going to really get to the issue of dominant discourse so that we can actually just name some stuff. And that's hopefully where we're going to lead to in a moment. There's two hands that are really burning to say something, and so I will say this as we listen to them, Leora. I think we should skip the next two slides and move you right into the microaggressions piece.
Yeah, great.
See, because I want to hear more about where is the courage to stand up and say something to those who could make a difference. You know, instead of staying on this level, you know, talking about students and using school for an example, talking about, you know, students and teachers. What about those who are actually in a position to make a difference and saying, hey, this is what the need is? Too oftentimes, I find that people who are in a position of any power still will not exercise that power in order to speak for those who they are serving. And so what happens down here never ever changes because nobody is saying anything. And then those down here are not allowed to go up here and tell anybody about what's going on. So then it becomes chaos. You know, and I think that for each and every person that's here in this room, that I think that that's something that we should all take a look at. How courageous are we? How much do we care? How much risk are we willing to take? What are you going to take from this conference that's going to make a difference in the people that you're serving? And not just go home and talk to somebody else about where you went and what you did. What, are we going to digest? I like to eat. I love to eat. See, I'm digesting. I ain't just talking to you, I'm talking to me. Because it's so important, because the fear of, you know, being, in many cases, blacklashed if you're talking to people of if I was talking to a supervisor of color, that I would receive that, and perhaps that same thing may happen to be white lashed. But more importantly, where do we begin there? You know, and having the dialogue around why not, you know, or cannot, or will not. But where is that dialogue?
Well, that's literally where we are hoping to get to about talking about the dialogue that needs to happen. I feel like you're a plant for us. Like, that is just beautiful. I mean, yeah, oh my God. Sorry, inside voice. So all I'm gonna do is I'm gonna bookmark what you just said, and I'm gonna call it Discourse 2. Because that's what we're gonna be unpacking in a moment. Like, what you just said was modeling the very discourse you're asking for. And I will simply say this as a precursor. Forgive my language, but my favorite definition of Discourse 2 is where we name shit. And to your question, the simplest answer to your question of where is this, why isn't this happening? The simplest answer, and it's a complex answer, at the very root of it is fear. And it is always fear. And for some people, it's fear because they're at risk of their livelihood. And for people who look like me, it's fear of, like I said, being called a racist. It's fear of losing unearned privileges that I know are not mine, and I stand up for equal rights, but I also know the benefits I'm getting every single day. Every single day. And right now in America, there's another fear we got to talk about. And we heard about our history this morning. Okay? We heard that history just didn't happen 200 plus years ago, 100 plus years ago. It happened last year. It's happening this year. It's happening right now as we're talking. And what's happening right now is, as a white person, consciously or unconsciously, I know that while my people have been in control, I know the criminal, horrific behaviors and actions we have taken on others. And as we get closer to the year that white people will not be 50% of the people in this country, there is a mass fear going on in our country right now, not because we believe people are bad and they're going to treat us bad, but we knew what it was like more than anyone else, what we did when we had power. And when we lose that power, we are afraid of being treated in the way we've treated other people. So there's fear.
Okay.
Real talk.
Yeah. No, name that shit. So, so I'm gonna ask for graceful forgiveness to hold for a little bit, because I do want to get to some juicy meat.
I say we jump into D1, D2.
I think so as well, because here's.
Okay. We don't need slides.
I'm not.
We don't need slides.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Okay, so here's what we want to offer.
Can I get some help? Just because I'll get caught up in how many
came
papers.
back on. That should not be the image. Okay. Can you help me while we're going over?
You may have to share, just because the number of people in the room is wonderful.
Greg, do you want to set this up while I get to at least the visuals so people can follow
Sure.
as we get there?
So, you know what? Like I said, we were going to go through and anchor our definitions about microaggressions in general. Again, we want to encourage you. There'll be resources to read. But here's where we were going with this. We were going to anchor ourselves in implicit bias. It's playing out. It's implicit to the people who have the bias. It's quite explicit to the people who are experiencing the bias. We wanted to talk about microaggressions and how, when we talk about microaggressions,
You will need to share.
Yes.
So please please share.
When we talk about microaggressions, they are called micro not because they don't matter. They are called micro because they are so subtle, they are so ingrained in the norm of our behaviors that people are left wondering, did that really just happen, or am I crazy? It's that paper cut where you're like, ooh, that hurt, ooh, darn. But it's when you get 100 of them on the same finger where you're like, I ain't taking another one. And again, those microaggressions are because they seem like, did that really happen? But to some people, it's not felt micro. So we want to just anchor that language. That was the quick shortcut, anchoring of the language, because we want to get to the place of saying, great, we know that implicit bias exists. Great, we know microaggressions exist. What we don't know always is how do we take it up? And there's lots of ways of taking it up. Those stages pointed out about the conditions that we need to be in to take it up. There's years of curriculum we can put behind those. But there's one tool that we want to introduce today around a different kind of discourse as an example of how we take it up. And so there's some great research out there. Again, this will be part of your appendix that you get. We really encourage you to do the reading around Changing the Discourse by Eubanks, Parrish, and Smith. But we're going to unpack the difference between Discourse 1 and Discourse 2. And I think because this group really needs to get into it, if you will appease me, I'll give us a quick shortcut version so we can move into the more interactive piece. All right? So I'd love to have one person who's willing to read out loud, very loud, the top of that T chart you have that have the two definitions, Discourse 1 and Discourse 2. Could somebody just read those two definitions loud?
The language typically used and talked about, question and plan the work of schools, change or reform. Discourse 1, dialogue supports and maintains the status quo without appearing unresponsive to outside demands for improvement.
Nice. Thank you. Someone else, Discourse 2?
Discourse 2, the language that tends to be about uncomfortable, unequal, ineffective, prejudicial conditions and relationships in schools. Discourse 2 opens up space for ambiguity and change to be part of a purposeful structure.
Thank you. So I want to be very clear here, because when we teach this, again, we force ourselves into false dichotomies all the time. So we're like, Discourse 1 is bad, Discourse 2 is good. Well, it's more effective, but when we talk about bad, we're not talking about the way, we're not talking about the national narrative about race right now. We're not talking about how we're talking about immigrants or Muslims right now. That's not discourse. That's Discourse 0. Discourse 1, we leave Discourse 1 conversations feeling good. We feel like we got some stuff done. It's about checking off the boxes. It's about getting things off our plate. We were effective. We got some stuff done. But we didn't get to the root issue. So what we did was we cleaned up the fire, but sustained the system that got us the fire in the first place. And so we need to get to Discourse 2, which is much more uncomfortable when we're running around 100 miles an hour, because it's leave conversations with more questions than answers, with more hard conversation, confronting and interrogating the belief systems behind our decisions. And that takes a lot of practice, and it takes a lot of tools, which you're not going to get all of that today, but we will share some of those. But one of the tools that was most effective with folks was this T-chart. Because after they read this text about it, they're like, wow, we really need to talk about it. That's where your quotes at the beginning came from, that text. And people are like, yeah, but what does it sound like? And so the T-chart is just an example of topics that would fall under Discourse 1 or Discourse 2 with some quotes to say, here's what it might sound like. So where we want to push you into some conversation is review those real briefly, but then turn the paper over and you'll see that there's blanks. And then at your tables, have one or two conversations, either table talk or maybe 3 people if it's a big conversation. So talk as a full table or 2 small groups. But go to the blanks on the back after you've read the examples and just have about 5 minutes of conversation saying, where is Discourse 1 present in your practice right now? What does it sound like? Put that quote right in there. What would it sound like if it were actually Discourse 2? And try to brainstorm what it might sound like to get to the root issue, to name stuff, rather than sit in the comfort of Discourse 1. All right, any clarifying questions? Again, we're just asking you to try it on. There's so much more you'll get when you go to the resources. Call either one of us over if you want support or need some support. If you're sitting alone, please join some other folks.
On the blank. So like, for example,
So, thank you. It's very, very difficult for us to just touch the surface of this topic as facilitators. So we're going to be passing out some feedback forms, and we hope that you'll use the feedback forms. One of the prompts is, what do you still need? So the request in doing this, when Leora and I were just prepping for this, we had put the agenda together, got it together, and then we came together again, and we're like, this is 3 agendas. But the need is there. And so we're like, do we feel okay planting seeds, knowing that there's more work and we'll give the resources? That was our call. But we also want to hear what needs you have leaving here. And some of them, I don't know how the structure of the registration works, but we will try to get some of those met. If there's examples of something people are looking for, put that in the I need box, and we'll see a way of getting that out to the community, etc. Even if there's just a conversation somebody wants to have, just make sure all the information so that you can get your need is included in the feedback form. But while that's coming around and while you're multitasking and getting to that, we just want to debrief a little bit of what we just sort of introduced around this idea of Discourse 1 and Discourse 2. Any reflections, any questions, any comments, any? Please.
I understand what you're saying 1 and 2.
Yeah.
But in terms of 1, it is so structured in the structure of the system.
Yeah.
And when you're talking about the counselor and system,
That's right.
you have to come in with, to even get to Discourse 2, some explanations and definitions need to be established.
That's right.
In
That's right.
Discourse 1.
That's right.
Before you can move to this.
That's right.
We're coming from different perspectives, based upon our own area of learning and how we've been positioned.
That's right.
And our position in the system.
So what we're hearing is that Discourse 2 is so complex and so big, and yet the way that our system is structured, we are so ingrained in Discourse 1, we have to do work in Discourse 1 to move out of it. And that is right on. That is right on. And if you go back to the framework, that's the second stage. That's the piece where we're creating conditions for interruption. That's where we're calibrating some of our definitions. That's where we're saying, that's where that strong leadership is important. And you're saying, folks, I have a leader that I'm working with, a school principal, who met with her staff after 2 years of trying to do equity work but trying to please everybody. She opened the year and she said, guess what? From this minute on, we're a Discourse 2 school. She said, I don't know what that's going to look like. I don't know what it's going to feel like. I'm just saying if we're not Discourse 2, we are not successful. So she just courageously said, we don't even know how we're going to get there, but we're being held accountable to be there today. And that shifted the conversation because they had done almost 2 years of prep work. And then she was like, oh, we can do this for another 20 years. So she had to say that, and yes, and there's tons of work in that conditions for interruption needed. Sometimes, some of the schools we work with just practice asking Discourse 2 questions. Literally, they sit in a circle and practice. They put a dilemma on the table, and they say, everyone come up with a Discourse 2 question. So I saw a hand here, and then here, and then there.
So for everyone who hears the Discourse 1 language at work, my question is what comes up for them that prevents them from naming it or addressing it? Because until you know what barriers are standing in the way or what fears are standing in the way, it's a big ask to say, let's just adopt Discourse 2.
Right.
Right?
But that's why there's that framework I talked about. And it doesn't have to be that framework. There has to be a framework. You can't say we're going to be Discourse 2, boom. Because if we're going to do that, let's cut to the chase. As of today, everyone is anti-racist. Done. Right? So you have to do the work. You have to do the community building, the identity work, etc. And I am getting notice that we are out of time. So I'm going to just close this. And I know there's 2 other questions. Please put those on your forms if you need to. And thank you all very, 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 very much. Have a wonderful day.
We're going to leave our emails up, and you will have all of this goodness that you could have had. Very good.
I know.
No, I just want to get this because it's full.